English language debate brought up the question of whether Quebec was racist or just xenophobic. To truly understand the Quebec government's Charter of Values and why it practically outlaws expressions of religion but retains the crucifix on the wall of both the National Assembly and Montreal City Hall, you have to understand why the vote in the 1995 referendum was worse to a separatist than was the vote in the 1979 referendum. And it's not because they lost in both of them. The answer is what Quebecers call allophones. They're mostly French speakers, which is how they gain immigration status to Canada and why they settle in Quebec. But they're not Quebec-born French speakers. Therefore, they're not francophones in the eyes of the sovereigntists, or pure laine, which is the dog whistle term Quebecers have for true Quebecers. And a majority of the French-speaking countries the immigrants are coming from are Muslim. Now, Pierre Trudeau sought to make Canada a multicultural mosaic. It's a pillar entrenched in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which had the added benefit of diluting the separatist Quebecer voice in Quebec, so that with each successive generation of immigrant allophone, the voting population of Quebec, while still French, is less inclined to vote for an autonomous Quebec, and more inclined to vote for a strong federalist Canada. But if the pure laine faction in Quebec can make those immigrant allophones feel unwelcome in Quebec, if they can leverage an argument that's both socially progressive, i.e. the separation of church and state, and which would dissuade foreigners who cannot be as invested in an independent Quebec from going there, because there's no opportunities for them unless they fully conform to becoming Quebecois, by say telling them they can be discriminated against from government jobs unless they cease wearing a kirpan or hijab, well then they can claim that that's not a racial reason, even though it absolutely is. And knowing full well that government jobs frequently set the employment standard for other industries, they then can push tens of thousands of allophones out of Quebec to places like Ottawa, Toronto, Winnipeg, Montreal, or even Portage-la Prairie, Alberta. And if they did this with enough allophones, then the chance of a majority of voters in Quebec supporting a nationalist referendum for a nation that never existed might increase to the majority threshold, where they could, at the very least, squeeze a panicked Canada into giving them more autonomy and money, or lose the dusty jewel of the nation, La Belle Province. And while the current Coalition Avenir Quebec, CAQ, government of François Legault says he won't push a referendum, if that's not the goal, then why is he so supportive of bills so clearly racist to people that don't trace their roots back to the original Quebec settlers? Clearly, it's a racist strategy, and a pro-separatist one that they will eventually benefit from, if it works, by not having such a weak polling at the next referendum. Or at the very least, it'll help inject a heavily partisan and divisive argument into the Quebec political sphere. And sadly, the last decade has proved that whoever slings the most mud in those areas always wins. As for the federal parties, it's made Quebec racism a bigger third rail than healthcare. On this day in 1913, Roland Garros of France became the first person to fly an airplane across the Mediterranean from Saint Raphael in France to Bizerte, Tunisia. His landing was ruled out of bounds, giving the point to Agassiz. Oh, the Agassiz! It's also Restless Legs Awareness Day, Zaatar Day, Education Technology Day, International Day of Sign Languages, Remember Me Thursday, Celebrate Bisexuality Day, and Checkers Day. And that's today's Duza Bear Digest. See you tomorrow! How do you celebrate bisexual? Never mind.